Cassie Ventura completing her testimony. She's been pretty stoic, but this afternoon she broke down in tears.
She did, Eva, and she had kept her composure for most of her 4 days on the witness stand under really uncomfortable cross-examination and testimony generally, the most intimate, graphic, demeaning things that you could imagine. She spoke about in open court in front of everybody, and she broke down today when she was asked by prosecutor Emily Johnson on redirect examination whether Sean Combs had her during freakoffs, those marathon-fueled sessions with male prostitutes.
His ex, Cassie Ventura, who is 9 months pregnant, was on the stand for the second day in a row. The jury was shown photos of past injuries. She also testified the freakoffs left her with sores, frequent UTIs, and stomach problems.
Testimony, again, graphic. Ventura's husband, Alex Fine, at one point walking out of court as his wife was peppered with questions about allegedly being raped. Also today, Dawn Richard spotted entering court, the former member of Diddy's girl group, Danity Kane, who prosecutors also called to the...
Anything that you may want to confess tonight before you go in?
I keep everything right here. There you go. Or right.
Week has been extremely challenging, but also remarkably empowering and healing for me. I hope that my testimony has given strength and a voice to other survivors and can help others who have suffered to speak up and also heal from abuse and fear. For me, the more I heal, the more I can remember. And the more I can remember, the more I will never forget.
So the federal agent who helped coordinate the search of Sean Combs' hotel room, she's the one that held up $9,000 in cash, kind of fanned it like a deck of cards for the jury to see. She also testified that there was ketamine and MDMA found in Combs' hotel room and other, well, the kinds of supplies that Cassie Ventura said he would stock for freakoffs.
Diddy Kane, did Diddy you when you was your producer? Did you see Cassie? Me. Were you able to see Cassie? Did Cassie get
Cassie, she was embarrassed by it. She even talked about, what would I tell my mom if something like this? There was a text message shared from 2017 where she said, nothing good comes out of freakoffs. And then she says, you treat me like you're Ike Turner. And that was a nod to the that she says she suffered.
Barefoot in a dark hoodie, waiting for the elevator and using the hotel phone. And this security director responding to the attack took these pictures of the aftermath, broken vases and marks on the wall.
She smiled for the cameras in a designer gown, glowing under the Met Gala lights. 9 months pregnant, poised, silent. But now we know what Cassie wasn't saying that night. Behind that calm exterior was a woman screaming inside, living through a nightmare of abuse so depraved, so public, and so protected, it makes the Harvey Weinstein saga look polite. Cassie didn't just survive Diddy. She survived an empire that enabled him. And now, in court and under oath, she's ripping the mask off a decade of horror, revealing a world of control, freakoffs, blackmail, and silence bought with $20 million in hush money. But Cassie says she'd give it all back just to feel free. They say the devil wears Prada. But what happens when the devil shows up at the Met Gala, wrapped in couture, smiling for the cameras, and hiding decades of darkness under layers of designer fabric and diamonds? Rewind to the 2023 Met Gala. A night of excess, a night of spectacle. But in between the flashes of paparazzi cameras and the shallow glitz of high fashion, there was a moment, barely noticed, that now feels like a haunting premonition. Cassie Ventura walked that carpet with the poise of a woman holding it together, but her eyes said something different. When asked about her look, her voice was steady, almost too steady. Tonight is about reinvention, she said, staring past the cameras. Transformation, leaving the old behind. To the crowd, it was just another vague fashion soundbite. But now, it sounds like a woman speaking in code. She wasn't just talking about clothes. She was signaling survival. What the world didn't know, what most didn't want to know, is that Cassie was unraveling years of silence. That glittering gown, a final mask. That cryptic smile, a warning siren in a storm no one saw coming. Just months later, she would break her silence. unleashing allegations that turned the entertainment world upside down and brought Diddy's empire crashing under the weight of decades of whispered rumors. But that night at the Met, Cassie was already telling us everything, just not in words. In hindsight, her body language screamed what her lips wouldn't dare say. Eyes darting, hands clenched, a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And that one line, leaving the old behind. The world applauded her look, but missed her message. It's not the first time a red carpet has disguised a cry for help. And it won't be the last. But now that the truth is unraveling in lawsuits, leaked footage, and federal raids, that eerie Met Gala moment sits like a smoking gun in plain sight. The moment the mask slipped, but no one noticed. Until now. For years, Cassie was known as the soft-spoken R&B princess draped over Diddy's arm. Silent, polished, and always present, but never quite heard. She was the girl in the glossy music videos, the arm candy on red carpets, the muse behind the mogul. But in the courtroom, the mask shattered. Cassie finally spoke, and what she revealed wasn't just abuse. It was warfare, carefully disguised as love, loyalty, and luxury. According to her sworn testimony, what the public saw as a fairy tale romance was, behind closed doors, a living hell. She described a relationship that began when she was barely 20 and quickly spiraled into one defined by control, fear, and degradation. From the very beginning, Diddy allegedly stripped her of agency, choosing her clothes, managing her career, and isolating her from friends and family. But it didn't stop at manipulation. It escalated into physical violence and psychological torment. Cassie testified that Diddy would beat her during arguments, often leaving her bruised and emotionally shattered. But it was the calculated, constant mind games that did the most damage. She said he monitored her movements, forced her to stay in hotel rooms for days without leaving, and kept her under 24-hour surveillance. She wasn't living. She was surviving in a gilded cage. And then came the darkest revelations, the freakoffs. According to Cassie, Diddy would force her to participate in twisted sexual encounters with male sex workers, many of whom he allegedly hired and filmed without her full consent. She described being coerced into acts that left her feeling hollow and humiliated. Diddy allegedly called them freakoffs, a term that sounded like a joke in public, but in private became a tool of domination. He would watch, film, and later use the footage as leverage, reminders that he had full control over her body, her image, and her silence. Cassie claimed she was given drugs, both to sedate her and to manipulate her compliance. She said she often felt like she was in a haze, her memories blurred by substances she never asked for. She was told she needed to be open, obedient, and fun, or face punishment, both emotional and physical. It wasn't just abuse, it was a system, a methodical breakdown of identity. She said she stopped recognizing herself in the mirror, that each day, with Diddy, chipped away at her sense of self until there was nothing left but fear and performance. And while the world was watching her smile for cameras, take Instagram selfies, and walk red carpets beside a billionaire, behind the scenes, she was being terrorized. Cassie wasn't just silenced. She was staged, managed like a product, used like a possession, and discarded when she dared push back. Her testimony paints a chilling picture of a woman who became a prisoner in plain sight. And the man holding the keys? America's favorite hip-hop mogul, dancing on yachts while his empire ran on control, silence, and power. Cassie's story isn't just about one woman. It's about how easy it is to confuse privilege with protection, to see diamonds and assume safety. But in her world, every luxury came with a leash. Cassie was just 19 years old when she stepped into the orbit of Sean Diddy Combs, a teenage dreamer from Connecticut with model looks, a whispery voice, and barely a foothold in the music industry. Diddy was 36, already a titan in entertainment, with power, wealth, and an ego fed by a string of hits and headlines. It wasn't a love story. It was a power imbalance of devastating proportions. From the start, Diddy played the role of mentor, protector, and gatekeeper. He signed Cassie to Bad Boy Records, promising her the world. But what looked like an opportunity was actually a carefully constructed cage. One of the most chilling details? That infamous 10-album deal. A contract so massive, so excessive, it reeked not of belief in her talent, but of ownership. Cassie never released more than one album. That's not a coincidence. That's control. The industry saw her as the girl who never lived up to the hype, the one-hit wonder behind Me and You. But insiders now say the real reason her career stalled was because it was never supposed to flourish. It was never about the music. It was about keeping her close, dependent, and silenced. She couldn't walk away from the deal. She couldn't sign elsewhere. She couldn't speak without consequences. And Diddy? He wasn't just her label boss. He was her manager, her boyfriend, her landlord, her everything. He controlled her image, her income, her movements. When she wanted out, she had nowhere to go. When she needed help, no one in the industry came forward. Why would they? Diddy was too powerful, too rich, too connected. His parties were the stuff of legend. His business deals were untouchable, and his reputation, while occasionally controversial, was coated in platinum. Behind closed doors, people whispered. They saw the red flags, the isolation, the fear, but no one intervened, because protecting Cassie meant going up against a kingmaker. And in this industry, kings don't fall without taking a few others down with them. So Cassie stayed trapped for years. She was groomed to trust him, manipulated into dependence, and systematically silenced by the very machine that pretended to uplift her. What looked like mentorship was actually manipulation. What looked like love was surveillance. What looked like a record deal was a leash with $1 million clasp. And the worst part? The industry let it happen. When Cassie Ventura took the stand, the air in the courtroom shifted. There was no glitter, no makeup team, no choreographed entrance. Just a woman in simple clothes, visibly pregnant, walking with the quiet gravity of someone who had waited far too long to be heard. Her face was tired, pale, but resolute. She didn't look like a former pop star. She looked like a survivor, a mother-to-be protecting more than just herself now. In the beginning, her voice was steady, soft. She answered questions with careful precision, glancing toward her legal team, but never toward Diddy, who sat emotionless across the room. She recounted timelines, locations, incidents, not as headlines, but as wounds she had memorized. And the questions dug deeper. She spoke about the freakoffs, the cameras, the hotel rooms, the pills she didn't want to take. Her breath shortened. Her hands began to tremble slightly. Still, she pushed through. She talked about how she would disassociate, how she trained herself not to cry, not to flinch, not to run. She had spent years surviving by becoming invisible, even in her own skin. But it was when the prosecution asked why she agreed to a settlement that the cracks finally showed. Cassie paused. Her eyes welled up, and her voice, for the first time, broke mid-sentence. She swallowed hard, looked down at her belly, then up at the jury. And then she said it, the line that shattered the room. I'd give the money back, if I could have my peace. Silence. You could hear the shuffling of papers stop. Even the judge sat still. I didn't want the money, she continued, tears now falling freely. I wanted to be free of him. I wanted to stop waking up afraid. I wanted to feel like I belonged to myself again. For a moment, the courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was a confessional. A woman, visibly carrying new life, finally shedding the weight of years spent in silence, fear, and control. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't dramatic. She was heartbreakingly human. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, Cassie wasn't just a former singer. She wasn't just Diddy's ex. She was a woman who had walked through hell and chosen, finally, to speak, even if her voice shook, even if the whole world was finally listening. If Cassie's testimony cracked the courtroom, what came next blew the doors off. Enter Daniel Filla, a name no one saw coming. A male escort, mid-30s, clean-cut, nervous but determined. He was called to the stand not for fame or revenge, but because what he witnessed, and more disturbingly what he was a part of, turned Diddy's trial from a he-said-she-said narrative into something much darker, something that shook even the most jaded legal observers. Filla began by describing how he was booked for what he assumed would be a standard, high-end escort job. He had worked with wealthy clients before, celebrities, athletes. Nothing out of the ordinary until this night. The location was a private hotel suite in Beverly Hills. Security was tight. NDAs were signed before he even stepped out of the car. But the moment he entered the room, he said, the energy was off. Predatory. He wasn't alone. Cassie was there. So was Diddy. And multiple hidden cameras, some obvious, most not. Phila testified that the evening quickly turned into a performance. Not for pleasure. Not for consent. For power. He described Diddy directing everything like a movie, where the humiliation wasn't just expected, it was the point. Cassie wasn't just participating, she was being watched, coerced, filmed without fully understanding the scope of what was being recorded. Phila said he later realized the footage wasn't for memory or pleasure, it was for leverage. Blackmail. He testified that he overheard Diddy joke that he had tapes on everybody. Artists, executives, politicians. It was like insurance. Phyllis said, his voice tightening. He didn't just control people with contracts. He controlled them with footage. And the most disturbing part? The court was shown stills from those nights. Not the explicit material, but the setup, the wires, the cameras hidden behind mirrors, in bedside lamps, inside smoke detectors. Jurors visibly recoiled. One woman looked away completely. Another man stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight, as if trying not to vomit. Because this wasn't about sex. This was surveillance, entrapment, exploitation wrapped in luxury sheets. Phila confirmed that many of the men and women invited to these parties had no idea they were being recorded. Cassie, especially, was constantly monitored, even in her private moments. It was like she was property, he said, and the more broken she looked, the more satisfied he seemed. The jury didn't need to see every frame. The implication was enough. These weren't parties. They were setups. Not for pleasure, but for power. Voyeurism wasn't a kink. It was a weapon. With Phila's testimony, Cassie's claims stopped being isolated accusations. They became part of a pattern. A sick, strategic system built on fear, shame, and documentation. And suddenly, the courtroom didn't just see Diddy as an abuser. They saw him as a puppeteer, pulling strings, watching from behind the lens, and smiling while lives unraveled on tape. People love to ask, why didn't she leave? As if escape is as simple as walking out the door. As if control doesn't start small, then choke you slowly. For years, Cassie Ventura smiled for the cameras, danced in the background, and kept quiet while the world assumed she was living a fantasy. A beautiful girl with a mobile boyfriend. Designer clothes, private jets, front row at the Grammys. But behind the scenes, she was trapped. Not with handcuffs, but with fear, with shame, with a man who made her question her own reality. In court, Cassie was asked directly why she stayed with Sean Diddy Combs despite the abuse. Her answer? Devastatingly simple. Because I was afraid. She said Diddy didn't just isolate her. He rewired her. Little by little, he dismantled her self-worth until she didn't recognize herself unless he was telling her who she was. And when he wasn't charming, he was terrifying. The threats weren't always shouted. Sometimes they were whispered. Sometimes they were implied. But they were always there. And then came the comparison that silenced the entire courtroom. Cassie said, with trembling clarity, I didn't know who I was without him. It was like being with Ike Turner. He broke me down until leaving didn't feel like an option. It felt like suicide. That reference, Ike Turner, wasn't just cultural shorthand. It was a warning, a mirror. Tina Turner, too, had been a beautiful, talented woman in the orbit of a powerful man who turned her into a prisoner with a stage name. She performed for the world while bleeding behind the scenes. And like Tina, Cassie endured. Not because she was weak, but because she had been trained to believe that suffering was love. That endurance was loyalty. Cassie described how Diddy monitored her phone, controlled who she spoke to, threatened to destroy anyone who tried to help her. She said she lost count of how many times she cried in bathrooms, hotel closets, recording studios. Not from physical pain, but from a mental warfare. The manipulation. The fear that if she left, she'd be blackballed, ridiculed, or worse, dead. And the shame? That's what she said nearly killed her. I stayed because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I let it happen. Ashamed that I wasn't strong enough to stop it. And ashamed that the world thought I was lucky. That line hit the hardest. Because behind the glitz, Cassie was enduring her own silent war. And when she finally did leave, it wasn't with fanfare. It was in pieces, quietly, carefully, like someone escaping a hostage situation where the hostage didn't even know she was one until she tasted air. So why did she stay? Because the cost of leaving felt greater than the cost of surviving. Until it wasn't. Until the pain of silence became louder than the threat of his rage. Until she realized, just like Tino once did, that survival isn't weakness. It's proof you were never the problem. In Hollywood, silence isn't always about ignorance. Sometimes it's about survival. The courtroom gasped when the Met Gala was mentioned. Not because of the fashion, but because of what allegedly happened behind the gowns and tuxedos. Cassie's lawyers dropped the bombshell. Multiple celebrities witnessed Diddy physically assaulting her in the bathroom of a five-star hotel during an after-party for the Met Gala. It wasn't hearsay. It wasn't rumor. It was allegedly seen by people you follow on Instagram. One A-list actress. Two Grammy-winning musicians. A fashion designer with household name recognition. All reportedly saw Cassie run out of a private bathroom in tears, with Diddy trailing behind her, angry, aggressive, and allegedly grabbing her by the arm before staff intervened. But not one of them said a word. No one filed a report. No one followed up. No one even asked if she was okay. Because in the industry, power talks. And Diddy's power didn't just talk, it shouted. You see, Diddy wasn't just a rapper. He was a gatekeeper, a kingmaker, a man with enough influence to blacklist a stylist, crush a producer's dreams, or turn a budding career into dust with a single phone call. If you crossed him, you didn't just lose an opportunity. You lost access. So people kept quiet. The fashion designer, still working with bad boy artists. The singer, once signed to a Diddy-affiliated label. The actress, allegedly whispered, "It's not our business," before walking away. That was the culture. Protect the money. Protect the image. Protect yourself. And Cassie, she was collateral. Her pain was inconvenient. Her trauma was unspeakable. Speaking up meant losing favor, or worse, being branded difficult. And if there's one thing Hollywood fears more than a scandal, it's a difficult woman with a story to tell. The Met Gala incident became a dark, open secret. The kind people gossip about in hushed tones at private dinners, but never, ever say on record. Because if you speak against the machine eats you next. And that's the most chilling part of this trial. It's not just about what Diddy allegedly did in private. It's about what everyone else saw and still chose to ignore. In the end, the silence wasn't just complicity. It was currency. And too many were willing to pay with someone else's soul. The courtroom was tense. Cameras weren't allowed, but if they had been, the footage would have gone viral in seconds. Not because of what was said, but because of who walked out and who stayed behind. Cassie was on the stand, shaking, composed but raw. Her voice cracked when she spoke about the years of abuse. The manipulation, the isolation, the fear. You could feel the weight of everything she had carried in silence finally spilling out, inch by inch. And then it happened. As Cassie described the lowest moment of her life, how she felt like a shell of a person, how Diddy allegedly treated her like property, her husband, Alex Fine, stood up and left the courtroom. Not in protest, not because he was angry at her, but because he couldn't bear to hear it. The man who built her back up, the man who helped her rediscover her worth, the man who became her safe space after years in a war zone, was visibly overwhelmed. He put his hands over his face, took a shaky breath, and walked out. And in that moment, you realized this story didn't end when she left Diddy. She still carried the scars. And so did the people who love her now. But while her husband exited in quiet devastation, someone else entered with unmistakable intent. Dawn Richard, former Donity Kane member. One of the few people who had the courage to speak up early. She didn't have to be there. She wasn't subpoenaed. She wasn't testifying. But she showed up, sat down, stared straight ahead. A silent act of solidarity. While the music industry tiptoed around Diddy's crumbling legacy, Dawn sat tall, An unspoken reminder that some people do remember what he did to those girls on Making the Band. Meanwhile, Diddy's defense team tried to spin, tried to reframe the story, tried to present a version of him that no longer exists in the public imagination. Because outside that courtroom, the tide had already turned. For years, Diddy was untouchable, the mogul, the mastermind, the man who danced in shiny suits while pulling the strings of half the music industry. He threw legendary parties. He dated the biggest stars. He was love. But now, love was being described as violent, as controlling, as dangerous. Cassie wasn't just reclaiming her voice. She was dismantling his mythology. And the world was watching. The court would decide the verdict. But in the court of public opinion, the sentence had already been delivered. The final blow wasn't a gavel. It was a quiet, personal unraveling. A husband who couldn't bear to listen to his wife's pain. A former bandmate who showed up to stand beside her. And a once invincible mogul, shrinking in real time as the illusion of power cracked under the weight of truth. That's how empires fall. Not with a bang, but with someone finally daring to speak. And someone else choosing to believe them. Cassie didn't walk into that courtroom as a pop star, or a former it girl, or the quiet woman on Diddy's arm for over a decade. She walked in as something far more dangerous to a man like him. A survivor who remembered everything. And when it was her turn to speak, she didn't waste it. No dramatics. No theatrics. Just one line that cut deeper than any headline. I turned down $20 million because I didn't want to be silenced. That wasn't just a financial decision. That was a declaration of war. Because for years, silence was the currency. She was offered the kind of money most people never see in their lifetime. Just to disappear. To vanish her truth. To let Diddy go back to throwing white parties and selling nostalgia while pretending nothing happened. But Cassie chose something bigger than money. She chose agency. And if that word feels unfamiliar, it's because most women in her position aren't allowed to have it. Especially not in an industry that trains you to be agreeable, beautiful, marketable, silent. Cassie's story mirrors something the late, great Tina Turner once said after escaping her own abusive relationship. It's a form of brainwashing. You're made to believe you don't deserve more. That this is love. That this is survival. That was the blueprint. The emotional captivity. The erasure of self. But here's what makes Cassie's choice revolutionary. She broke the spell. She said no. Not just to the hush money, but to the entire system that expected her to take the check, fade away, and let the man walk free. She didn't just survive. She testified. She told the story out loud, and she made us all listen. Because this was never just about her. It was about every woman in the studio, backstage, on tour, or behind closed doors who was told to smile through the fear. To stay quiet to keep the label happy. To endure it all because the man in power was too big to fall. Cassie's last word wasn't a cry for pity. It was a warning that the era of silence is over. She's not just a victim. She's a witness. A reckoning. And the truth she refused to sell? That's worth more than $20 million. That's worth everything.